Monkey D. Luffy is defined by his absolute freedom, and in the original world of One Piece, that freedom is physically represented by rubber, a body that can bend, stretch, and take any blow, eventually turning into the literal sun god Nika. But what if Luffy's path to freedom didn't rely on a devil fruit? What if he was born into the East Blue possessing the genetic miracles of the Jujutsu world, namely the limitless technique and the six eyes? In this reality, Luffy isn't a goofy rubber kid who people laugh at. He is an untouchable, enigmatic force of nature from the day he is born. Today, we are breaking down the entire timeline of One Piece if Luffy possessed the reality-bending arsenal of Satoru Gojo. To understand Gojuffy, we have to look at his childhood. In the original story, Luffy eats the Gamu Gamu no fruit out of frustration and hunger. But here, Luffy doesn't need a fruit because the six eyes are an inherited genetic trait. From birth, Luffy's brain is bombarded with an infinite amount of visual and sensory information. Without a blindfold, the sheer volume of data would fry his young mind. Imagine Garp trying to give Luffy his famous Fist of Love. Garp swings down with massive force and his fist stops a millimeter away from Luffy's hair. Garp is completely baffled, realizing his grandson has a natural, invisible barrier. This is infinity. It takes the finite space between Luffy and an incoming attack and divides it infinitely. The closer an object gets, the slower it moves, never truly making contact. When Shanks and the Red Hair Pirates arrive at Fuchsia Village, Shanks doesn't see a clumsy kid. He sees a boy who already possesses an observation capability that easily surpasses advanced future sight. The six eyes allow Luffy to see the atomic composition of the world around him. In One Piece terms, Luffy can see the flow of lineage factors and the raw energy of Haki before anyone even explains what it is. When Iguma the Mountain Bandit tries to humiliate Luffy by smashing a brown bottle over his head, the liquid and glass freeze perfectly in the air around Luffy, dropping harmlessly to the floor without a single drop touching his hair. Luffy doesn't even get angry, he just looks up with those piercing blue eyes beneath his hat. Shanks doesn't need to step in at all. Luffy simply points a small finger at Higuma and whispers a single word, lapse. When he sets sail at age 17, the East Blue isn't a challenge, it's a legal separation of his enemies from their health bars. Look at his first major encounters. Alvida swings her massive spiked iron club and it stops dead in the air. Luffy doesn't even look at her. With a light flick of his wrist, he applies cursed technique lapse, blue. Bright blue sphere condenses in front of him, and Alvida and her entire crew are violently sucked toward the center of gravity, crashing into each other in a massive pile before Luffy blows them off the deck with a standard punch. When he meets Zoro at Shell's town, Zoro is stunned. He watches Captain Morgan's Marines fire a full volley of executioner bullets, but Luffy just stands there, hands in his pockets, straw hat tilted back. The bullets drop to the ground like pebbles hitting a brick wall. Zoro realizes this kid doesn't just have an elite devil fruit, he operates on a completely different level of physics. The Arlong Park arc becomes a masterclass in psychological terror for the fishmen. Arlong prides himself on the physical superiority of his race and throws his devastating shark on tooth drill attack straight at Luffy's chest. Luffy doesn't move. Arlong's nose stops right against Luffy's shirt. Luffy looks down, lifts his blindfold just enough to flash one glowing blue eye, and casually tells Arlong that if he thinks his jaw is strong, he should see how he handles gravity. With a flash of red light, Luffy unleashes cursed technique reversal, red. The massive repulsion force of divergence blasts Arlong straight through the entire height of Arlong Park, shattering the building into dust with a single, instantaneous shockwave while Nami watches in absolute awe. As Luffy enters the Grand Line, the rules change. This is the era of Logia Devil Fruits, elements that cannot be hit by physical attacks unless you use Haki. But Gojuffy changes the dynamic of these fights completely. Take Crocodile in Alabasta. Crocodile's entire strategy relies on drying out his opponents or turning into sand to avoid damage. When he tries to use his desert execution attacks on Luffy, the sand can't get past the infinity barrier. Crocodile tries to dehydrate him by grabbing his arm, but his hand can never actually make contact with Luffy's skin. To hurt a Sandman without water or advanced armament Haki, Luffy utilizes cursed technique lapse, blue to create a high-density vacuum. Luffy uses blue to forcibly compress the air and sand together, condensing Crocodile's localized sand form into a hyperdense solid sphere, completely locking him out of his elemental Logia state before shattering his defense. Then comes Skypiea. Enel unleashes a massive 100 million volt Thor straight from the heavens, striking Luffy directly. The smoke clears and Luffy is standing there completely pristine. The infinite spatial barrier doesn't just stop solid objects, it stops energy, heat, and electrical currents from bridging the gap to his body. Enel undergoes a massive psychological breakdown, realizes his god status is a joke, and gets absolutely obliterated when Luffy uses a Haki-infused red to blast him clean off his flying arc. By the time we reach Enies Lobby, Luffy usually invents Gear 2nd and Gear 3rd to keep up with the hyperfast, armor-piercing martial arts of CP9. But a Luffy with the six eyes doesn't need to pump his blood faster or blow air into his bones. Instead, he applies Gojo's ultimate peak-tier sorcery to his movement, spatial teleportation via the Limitless. Rob Lucci uses Sorrow to vanish, thinking he has the speed advantage. But the Six Eyes allow Luffy to track Lucci's precise atomic position in real time. By manipulating the concept of distance using blue, Luffy instantly teleports directly behind Lucci. Lucci spins around and executes his ultimate attack, the Rokuogen Shockwave, which passes through physical bodies. But the shockwave still requires space to travel and hit a target, and Infinity filters out the kinetic energy of the shockwave entirely. Instead of a massive Gamu Gamu no jet Gatling to take down the Judicial Tower, Luffy steps back, combining the forward motion of blue and the reverse motion of red. He calls out Imaginary Technique, purple, and a massive purple sphere of erase space tears through Enies Lobby, cleanly erasing Rob Lucci, the Buster Call warships in its path, and half of the Judicial Tower from existence in a single terrifying second. This brings us to the tragedy of Sabaody Archipelago. In the original timeline, Luffy faces absolute despair because he cannot protect his crew from Admiral Kizaru and Bartholomew Kuma. With Gojo's powers, Sabaody plays out completely differently. Kizaru arrives, moving at the speed of light, and kicks at Luffy. Light is composed of photons, particles traveling through space. Because it occupies space and travels toward a target, Infinity slows it down to an absolute crawl. Kizaru's foot freezes inches from Luffy's face, the brilliant light completely unable to breach the barrier. Kizaru, for the first time in his life, is completely immobilized by someone else's speed and defensive capability. Furthermore, because Luffy has the Six Eyes, his mastery over Haki by this point would be entirely flawless. The Six Eyes allow him to optimize his energy consumption down to an infinitesimal fraction of a percent. This means Luffy can code his physical strikes and advance Conqueror's Haki and armament Haki indefinitely without ever running out of stamina or experiencing the exhaustion that limits other top-tier fighters in the New World. He becomes a perpetual motion machine of pure, unadulterated combat power. All of this culminates in the Marineford War. Luffy drops from the sky to save Ace, but he isn't a rookie pirate scrambling through a battlefield of giants anymore. He walks through Marineford like a god walking among mortals. Mihawk slashes at him with the world's strongest black sword, but the flying slash divides the air only to stop dead before it can touch Luffy's coat. Akinu unleashes a massive fist of magma. The heat radiates, but the physical substance of the lava cannot burn through the infinite space surrounding the future Pirate King. When the entire Marine force closes in to stop him from unlocking Ace's handcuffs, Luffy decides to end the war entirely. He doesn't just let out a burst of Conqueror's Haki to knock out the weak-willed soldiers. He unleashes the absolute peak of the limitless technique, adapted perfectly to the grand scale of the sea, crossing his fingers and declaring domain expansion, unlimited void. The entire sky over Marineford turns into a dark, cosmic void filled with fractured prisms of light and infinite celestial imagery. The animations of the Marines, Akinu, Aokiji, and even Sengoku completely freeze, their eyes going blank. Instead of just knocking people out, Luffy's domain forces every single mind within Marineford to process the infinite information of the entire universe all at once. The admirals, the vice-admirals, and the executioners are completely paralyzed, trapped in a state of forced, overwhelming enlightenment where they can see and feel everything, yet can do absolutely nothing. Luffy casually walks up, breaks Ace's chains, looks at a frozen Sengoku, laughs his signature Shishishi laugh, and walks away with his brother. With the power of the Limitless and the Six Eyes, Luffy doesn't just conquer the Grand Line, he shatters the very concept of the world government's control, becoming the freest man on the ocean because in a world built on power, absolutely no one can touch him.